I do ocean research for the military. What we found is terrifying. The regulator felt solid between my teeth as I dropped through the water column, watching my depth gauge tick past 200 feet. My rebreather hummed quietly on my back, the familiar sound that had kept me alive through hundreds of commercial salvage dives over the past decade. This time, though, nobody was paying me to be down here. I adjusted my buoyancy and checked the LED array mounted on my helmet. The lights cut through the Caribbean blue like white knives, illuminating particles that drifted past my mask. 40 miles off the coast of Belize, the water was cleaner than anything I'd ever worked in during my commercial jobs. No oil slicks, no harbor debris, just crystal visibility that stretched out beyond my light's reach. "How's the view down there? Workaholic?" Eleanor's voice crackled through my comm system from the surface vessel. I could picture her up there, probably hunched over some marine archaeology samples she'd brought along from Miami, instead of enjoying the sunshine like a normal person on vacation. Says the woman who brought lab work to the Caribbean, I muttered into my comm. Her laugh carried through the static. At least I'm not spending my vacation doing the exact same thing I do for work. What do you call a dive instructor who goes diving on his day off? A guy who knows what he likes. A guy who needs better hobbies. I passed 250 feet and felt the familiar pressure change in my ears. The reef formations I'd spotted on the surface charts should be coming up soon, but so far I was seeing nothing but empty blue water. My dive computer showed a bottom depth of around 400 feet in this area, which meant I had plenty of room to explore without hitting serious decompression limits. The whole point of this trip had been to get away from the structured commercial dives that paid my bills. No supervisors breathing down my neck, no strict bottom times dictated by salvage schedules, no insurance paperwork waiting for me, topside. Just me and whatever the ocean wanted to show me. "I'm at 300 feet, I reported, watching the numbers scroll past on my computer. "Should be seeing some coral formations soon." "Copy that. How's your gas supply looking?" I glanced at my rebreather's display, still running green across the board. This rig could keep me down here for hours if I wanted. Not that I planned to push those limits. Even on vacation, I wasn't stupid. But having the extra margin meant I could take my time, really examine whatever caught my interest, instead of rushing through like I did on paying jobs. I reached for the high-frequency sonar unit, clipped to my belt, and powered it up. The device would give me a better picture of the seafloor topology than just swimming around, hoping to bump into something interesting. The display flickered to life, showing the familiar grid pattern as it began mapping the area below me. At first, the readings looked exactly like what I'd expected. Scattered coral formations, some rocky outcroppings, the usual debris field of broken shells and marine growth. Standard Caribbean reef system. Nothing that would make it into any diving magazines. Then something massive appeared on the edge of my sonar range. I stared at the display, thinking the unit had malfunctioned. The signature showed an object roughly 800 feet long, sitting perfectly upright on the seafloor. That couldn't be right. Nothing natural grew in those kinds of geometric proportions, and nothing man-made that size should be sitting uncharted in these waters. I ran the scan again, adjusting the frequency to get a clearer reading. The object remained solid and unmistakable. Not only was it huge, but the sonar was reading it as metallic, dense metallic composition with clean, regular edges that suggested human construction. "Eleanor, you getting this telemetry feed up there?" A pause. Then her voice came back sharp with interest. "Holy Liam, what am I looking at? That's what I'm trying to figure out. This thing is massive, and it's sitting in an area that's supposed to be empty seafloor, according to every chart I've seen." I heard papers rustling through the comm as she pulled up her reference materials. Eleanor had brought enough maritime databases to outfit a small library. Part of her obsessive need to document everything properly. "I'm not showing any recorded wrecks in your area," she said after a few minutes. "Nothing even close to that size. Are you sure your sonar isn't picking up some kind of geological formation?" I studied the display again, tracing the clean lines of whatever was down there. Geology doesn't grow in straight lines like this. Look at that symmetry. Those are hull lines, Eleanor. This thing was built, not born. But 800 feet long, that's ocean liner territory. If something that big went down in these waters, there would be records. There would have been massive search and rescue operations. You don't just lose a ship that size and forget about it. She was right. Of course, a vessel that large would have been international news when it sank. There should be historical records, survivor accounts, insurance claims, something that would have put it on the maritime charts. But my sonar wasn't lying, and I'd been reading these displays long enough to trust what they were telling me. "Maybe it's older than our databases go back," I suggested. "Early 1900s, before modern record keeping. Even then, Liam, something that big would have left traces. Newspaper accounts, passenger manifests, shipping company records." I adjusted my position in the water, trying to get a better angle on the object. The sonar painted it in stark detail now, showing what looked like multiple deck levels, and even structural features that suggested superstructure. Not just a hull, but an intact vessel sitting upright on the bottom, as if it had been gently lowered into place. "How deep is it sitting?" Eleanor asked. I checked my readings. Bottom contact at 450 feet. That puts the top of whatever this is at maybe 350 feet, assuming it's sitting level. That's well within your operational limits. I could hear the excitement building in her voice. Eleanor lived for this kind of discovery, the possibility of finding something that had been lost to history. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I felt my own curiosity shifting from casual vacation interest to professional obsession. "You want me to go take a look?" I said. "I want you to be careful, but yes. If you're comfortable with the dive profile, this could be significant. If it's really an unknown wreck of that size, we're talking about a major archaeological find." I ran through my gas calculations one more time. The deeper penetration would cut into my bottom time, but my rebreather gave me enough margin to make the dive safely, if I managed it properly. And the thought of having discovered something completely unknown was too tempting to resist. "All right," I said, adjusting my buoyancy control and beginning my descent toward the mysterious signature. "Let's go see what we've got down there." My dive computer began recalculating my decompression obligations as I dropped deeper. The water grew darker around me, the brilliant Caribbean blue fading to a deep indigo that would soon become black. I checked my lights again, making sure all systems were functioning properly for what was about to become a much more serious dive than I had planned. "Stay on comms." Eleanor's voice followed me down. "I want to hear everything you see." "Copy that, beginning approach to target now." The sonar signature grew larger on my display as I descended, revealing more detail with each passing foot. Whatever was down there, it was about to rewrite everything we thought we knew about this section of the Caribbean seafloor. My depth gauge read 420 feet, when the first edges of something massive began to take shape in the darkness below. I adjusted my LED array to maximum intensity, the white beams cutting through the deep water like searchlights. What emerged from the gloom made me stop mid-descent and check my instruments twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from nitrogen narcosis. A ship, not the broken, twisted wreck I expected to find, but an intact passenger liner sitting upright on the seafloor as if someone had gently lowered it into place with a giant crane. "Eleanor, are you getting the video feed from my camera?" "I'm recording everything." "Liam, what am I looking at here?" I pushed deeper, my computer showing 450 feet as the full scope of the vessel revealed itself. The ship stretched out beyond the reach of my lights in both directions, confirming the 800 feet length the sonar had detected. But length was just the beginning of what made this discovery impossible to believe. The hull looked perfect. No impact damage, no structural collapse, none of the twisted metal and scattered debris fields that marked every deep-sea wreck I'd ever explored in my commercial career. Multiple decks rose from the main hull in elegant tiers, each one clearly defined and structurally sound. Ornate railings ran along promenade areas that should have been twisted and broken after decades underwater. I maneuvered closer to the bow section, my lights playing across details that belonged in a maritime museum, not on a seafloor that had supposedly been empty since the last ice age. Decorative elements that should have corroded or fallen away remained in place. Brass fittings that should have turned green with verdigris still gleamed under my LED array. The preservation down here is unbelievable, I reported, swimming along the starboard side. I'm seeing ornamental details that look like they were installed yesterday. That's impossible at that depth. Even in ideal conditions, you should be seeing significant deterioration after any substantial time underwater. I knew she was right. Every wreck I'd worked showed the effects of marine environment exposure, metal corrosion, marine growth, structural weakening from pressure and current action. This ship looked like it had been underwater for months, not decades or centuries. Swimming closer to the bow, I angled my lights toward what should be the nameplate area. Most ship names corroded away or became unreadable within years of sinking. But as my beams swept across the forward hull, elegant script letters appeared in sharp relief against the dark metal. "I've got the ship's name," I said, focusing my camera on the inscription. "It says Orion." Papers rustled through my comm as Eleanor immediately began checking her references. "Or I'm not finding any passenger vessel by that name in my wreck databases. Not in Caribbean waters, not anywhere close to this size." I positioned myself to get better footage of the nameplate, noting the distinctive lettering style. The script looked early 20th century, formal and elaborate in the way ship names were designed during the golden age of ocean travel. But if this was a luxury liner from that era, it should be famous. Ships this size didn't just disappear from historical records. "The design looks pre-World War I said, swimming back to examine the superstructure. "Look at those deck arrangements, the funnel placements. This has to be from the 1910s or 20s. But Liam, a ship that size from that period would be documented everywhere. Passenger manifests, shipping company records, newspaper coverage when it was launched. You don't build an 800-foot liner and have it vanish from history books." I continued my survey along the port side, my lights revealing rows of portholes that should have been smashed or missing. Instead, most still contained glass that reflected my LED beams back at me, like dozens of eyes watching my approach. The effect was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite explain. The promenade decks stretched out above me, featuring cabin windows that remained intact and clearly defined. I could make out deck chairs positioned behind the railings, though whether they were original furnishings or debris that had settled into place, I couldn't tell from my current position. "I need to get closer to the superstructure," I said, checking my gas supply and dive computer. "The detail work on this thing is incredible. It's like finding a perfectly preserved museum piece." "How's your decompression looking?" I glanced at my computer display. The extended time at depth was building up my mandatory stop requirements, but my rebreather gave me enough gas supply to handle a longer bottom time safely. "I'm still good for another 20 minutes at this depth, if I manage my ascent properly. Take your time, document everything you can. If this really is an unknown historical vessel, we need comprehensive footage." I swam higher to examine the boat decks, where I expected to find empty davits and maybe some debris from lifeboats that had been launched or torn away during the sinking. Instead, I found something that made me question my own instruments again. Several lifeboats remained in their davits, perfectly positioned and apparently undamaged. The canvas covers looked intact, the launching mechanism still in place. It was as if the ship had been abandoned in calm seas, with enough time for an orderly evacuation, then somehow transported to this depth without any of the trauma typically associated with a marine disaster. Eleanor, I'm seeing lifeboats still in position, multiple boats still secured in their davits. That doesn't fit any known sinking scenario. If the ship went down in calm enough conditions to preserve the boats, there should be historical records of the rescue operations. I moved my camera along the boat deck, documenting each lifeboat position. The lack of any impact damage became more pronounced the longer I examined the wreck. No collision scars, no explosion damage, no evidence of fire or structural failure. The Orion looked like it had simply decided to descend intact to the ocean floor. Swimming towards the stern, I found the same impossible preservation. Deck machinery that should have been scattered or corroded remained in place. Railings that should have been torn away by the forces of sinking stood straight and secure. Even smaller details like deck hardware and fittings looked practically new. The stern section is just as intact as everything else, I reported. I'm not seeing any traditional signs of maritime disaster. No debris field, no impact damage, no evidence of catastrophic sinking. Keep documenting. This is either the most perfectly preserved wreck in maritime history, or we're dealing with something that challenges everything we know about deep-sea preservation. I continued my circuit of the vessel, my camera capturing every detail, while my mind tried to process what I was seeing. In 15 years of commercial diving, I'd explored dozens of wrecks across different oceans and depths. Every single one showed the expected signs of time, pressure, and marine environment exposure. The Orion defied every rule I knew about underwater archaeology. What struck me most was the complete absence of life. No fish swimming through broken sections, no marine growth on exposed surfaces, no coral formations beginning to establish themselves on the hull. The ship sat in sterile isolation on the seafloor, as if the normal cycle of marine ecosystem colonization had simply passed it by. I swam back toward the main superstructure, drawn by the rows of intact windows that seemed to watch my every movement. My lights reflected off glass that should have been broken by pressure changes or impact, creating an eerie effect as if the ship's interior was somehow lit from within. I'm going to need to come back with a full archaeological team, I said, beginning to plan my ascent. This site is going to rewrite maritime history textbooks, assuming we can figure out how an 800-feet passenger liner ended up on the seafloor with no historical record of its existence. I took one last comprehensive sweep with my camera, documenting the Orion from bow to stern. Whatever had brought this ship to the bottom of the Caribbean, it hadn't followed any conventional sinking scenario. The vessel looked ready to resume its voyage, as if its passengers had simply vanished mid-journey, leaving behind a perfectly preserved ghost ship waiting on the ocean floor. My circuit of the Orion's exterior had revealed nothing but more questions, each perfectly preserved detail adding to the impossibility of what I was documenting. Swimming back along the starboard side toward the bow, I searched for some way to examine the ship's interior spaces. The portholes remained intact and dark, offering no glimpse of what lay within, but my lights caught something different about one section of the promenade deck. A lifeboat davit hung at an odd angle, twisted away from its mounting points, and creating a jagged opening in the ship's side. Unlike everything else I'd observed, this showed actual damage. Metal torn outward, as if the davit had been ripped away during some kind of evacuation or accident. The breach was large enough for me to swim through comfortably without risking my equipment on sharp edges. Eleanor, I found an entry point. Looks like a lifeboat davit tore away and opened up the starboard promenade deck. You're going inside. Her voice carried a mix of excitement and concern. Be careful in there. Interior ship spaces can be disorienting even in perfect conditions. I positioned myself at the breach and activated my emergency strobes, clipping them to the opening so I could find my exit route easily. The last thing I wanted was to get turned around inside an unfamiliar wreck at this depth. My primary lights cut through the opening, revealing a space that shouldn't exist in any underwater environment I'd ever encountered. The first-class promenade stretched out before me, like a scene from a luxury hotel rather than a sunken ship. Dining tables remained set with white china and polished silverware, each place setting arranged with precise attention to detail. Upholstered chairs sat grouped in conversation circles, their fabric appearing pristine under my LED beams. Above it all, crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their numerous facets catching and reflecting my lights in thousands of glittering points. I swam slowly through the promenade, my camera capturing every impossible detail while my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. No marine growth covered the surfaces. No sediment had settled on the table. Linens the space looked like the passengers had stepped away minutes ago, not decades or centuries. The interior preservation is even more incredible than the exterior. I reported focusing my camera on a dining table, where wine glasses still sat upright beside each plate. I'm looking at place settings that look ready for dinner service. The fabric on these chairs should have deteriorated completely by now. Are you seeing any personal effects? Anything that might help date the vessel or identify passengers? I moved deeper into the promenade, examining the arranged furniture and decorative elements. Everything appeared deliberate and orderly, as if the ship had been prepared for guests who simply never arrived. No scattered belongings, no signs of panic or hurried evacuation, just an elegant dining space, waiting in perpetual readiness. Nothing personal yet, I said, swimming toward what appeared to be a grand entrance leading deeper into the ship's interior. But the level of detail in here is museum quality. Whatever happened to this ship, it wasn't a typical maritime disaster. The doorway ahead opened into an even more impressive space, and I pushed through carefully, checking my gas supply and dive computer. My rebreather showed solid performance across all systems, giving me confidence to continue the interior exploration that would normally require extensive safety protocols on a commercial salvage job. The grand ballroom revealed itself. As I passed through the entrance, a massive space that dominated the ship's central structure. Ornate columns supported a vaulted ceiling decorated with elaborate moldings and artistic details that belonged in a European palace rather than a Caribbean seafloor. The polished dance floor stretched out before me, its surface reflecting my lights like black glass. I swam higher to examine the columns and ceiling details, documenting the incredible craftsmanship that had somehow survived intact in this impossible environment. The ballroom could easily accommodate several hundred guests, with multiple tiers of seating areas, and what appeared to be a raised stage for orchestral performances. That's when I noticed my dive computer, flashing a warning I'd never seen before. The thermal protection alert showed water temperature dropping rapidly around me from the standard Caribbean warmth I'd maintained throughout the dive to readings that suggested much deeper, colder water. I checked my instruments twice, thinking the sensors had malfunctioned, but the temperature continued falling, while my computer warned about extended exposure risks. My thermal readings are going crazy in here, I told Eleanor, adjusting my position to see if the temperature change was localized. Dropping fast enough to trigger gear warnings. Could be internal currents from the wreck creating thermoclines. Big ships can generate some weird water movement patterns even when they're stationary. That made sense from a physics standpoint, and I'd encountered similar effects in large commercial wrecks, where internal spaces created unusual water circulation. But as I continued documenting the ballroom, Something else caught my attention that had nothing to do with temperature or currents. A distortion in the water directly ahead of me, barely visible in my peripheral vision, but unmistakable when I focused on it. The kind of optical effect you might see from heat waves rising off hot pavement, except we were 450 feet underwater where heat waves couldn't exist. I approached cautiously, thinking my lights might be creating some kind of reflection off the polished surfaces around me. But as I moved closer, the distortion began to take shape, becoming more defined and structured, rather than dispersing as an optical illusion should. The shape of a woman appeared in the water before me. Not solid, but translucent and shimmering, like a projection cast through liquid glass. She wore an elaborate evening gown that moved in ways that had nothing to do with water currents, the fabric flowing around her as if she stood in open air rather than the ocean depths. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style that belonged to the early 1900s, matching the ship's apparent historical period. But her face was what stopped my breathing entirely, twisted in an expression of absolute terror. Her mouth opened wide in a scream that produced no sound in the underwater silence. Her eyes, wide with panic and desperation, seemed to look directly at me, as if she could see through the decades or centuries that separated us. I hung motionless in the water, my camera forgotten as I tried to process what I was seeing. The woman's form became clearer, more defined, as if my attention somehow strengthened her ability to manifest in this impossible space. Then, from doorways and shadowed alcoves throughout the ballroom, more figures began to appear, dozens of them emerging like actors, taking the stage for some ghostly performance. Men in formal dinner jackets, their faces bearing the same expression of terror and confusion. Women clutching at phantom children, their evening gowns trailing behind them in ways that defied underwater physics. Ship's officers in uniform, their caps askew, and their faces marked by the same silent screams that characterized them all. The ballroom filled with spectral passengers and crew, each one translucent and shimmering, each one trapped in the same moment of absolute horror that had claimed the woman in the evening gown. They moved through the water without displacing it, their forms growing more solid and defined as more appeared from every corner of the grand space. None of them made any sound, but their collective presence created a pressure in my consciousness that had nothing to do with diving depth. The temperature continued dropping around me, while my instruments registered readings that made no sense for Caribbean waters at any depth. I reached for my camera with trembling hands, knowing that Eleanor needed to see this, but uncertain whether any recording equipment could capture what defied every law of physics and biology. I understood. The spectral passengers of the Orion had found their audience, and I was no longer just documenting a historical wreck. I was witnessing the impossible. The woman in the evening gown stepped closer, her terrified expression fixed directly on me, as if she could see through whatever barrier separated the living from the dead. Behind her, the other spectral figures began moving with deliberate purpose rather than the aimless drifting I'd first observed. They weren't randomly haunting this space. They were responding to my presence. I tried to back toward the doorway. I'd entered through, my fins pushing against the water in slow, careful movements. But as I moved, the ghostly passengers moved with me, forming an increasingly dense wall of translucent forms between me and my exit route. Men in formal dinner jackets materialized directly in my path, their bow ties askew, and their faces bearing that same expression of absolute terror. Women clutched at phantom children, who flickered in and out of visibility, their evening gowns trailing behind them in impossible currents. Ship's officers appeared among the passengers, their uniforms torn and their caps hanging at odd angles. One of them, a man with captain's stripes on his sleeves, stood directly in front of the ballroom entrance. His mouth moved as if he were shouting orders, but no sound reached me through the water. His hands gestured frantically at something I couldn't see, replaying commands from a disaster that had happened decades or centuries ago. None of them seemed malicious or threatening. Instead, their movements carried a desperate pleading quality that made my chest tighten with something beyond physical pressure. They reached toward me with ethereal hands that couldn't quite make contact, their fingers passing through my equipment without resistance, yet somehow creating drag against my movement through the water. "Eleanor, I need you to listen carefully," I said into my calm, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The wreck is inhabited. I'm surrounded by what appear to be spectral manifestations of the ship's passengers and crew." Static filled my headset in response, punctuated by fragments of Eleanor's voice that cut in and out like a radio trying to tune through atmospheric interference. "I'm here." Breaking up, the interference grew worse as the ghostly figures pressed closer, their forms becoming more solid and defined with each passing moment. I could make out individual facial features now, details of clothing and jewelry that belonged to the early 1900s. A woman with an elaborate feathered hat held an infant that phased between visible and transparent. A young man in a steward's uniform clutched a passenger manifest that existed only in whatever realm these spirits inhabited. "What's happening?" Lost signal. Eleanor's voice faded into whispers that had nothing to do with radio transmission. Voices speaking words I couldn't understand. Conversations in languages that might have been French or German. Fragments of panic and confusion that seemed to bleed through whatever frequency my comm system used. Then the impossible became even more surreal. Light began emanating from the ship itself, not the harsh white beam of my LED array, but warm golden illumination that had no identifiable source. Crystal chandeliers that had hung dark and lifeless moments before now glowed with phantom electricity, their faceted surfaces casting prismatic patterns across the ballroom's walls. Sconces along the walls flickered to life with gas flames that produced no heat, no bubbles, no effect on the surrounding water. The ballroom transformed around me from a sunken relic into an active social space frozen in time. Tables set for dinner service gleamed under the spectral lighting, while additional passengers materialized at chairs that had appeared empty moments before. They sat in conversation groups, their mouths moving in silent dialogue while they gestured with wine glasses that contained nothing but seawater. In the far corner of the ballroom, on the raised stage I'd observed earlier, an entire orchestra took their positions behind instruments that shouldn't exist in this underwater environment. A conductor, in formal evening wear, raised his baton, and though I heard no music through the water, the musicians began playing with synchronized precision. Their movements suggested a waltz, something elegant and mournful that accompanied the ghostly social gathering around me. The spectral passengers turned their attention to the phantom orchestra, swaying in their chairs as if listening to music. Couples rose from dining tables and moved onto the dance floor, their forms gliding across the polished surface in perfect ballroom formation. Evening gowns swirled around dancing women, while their partners guided them through steps that followed rhythms, existing only in whatever dimensional space these spirits occupied. But through it all, their faces maintained that expression of terror and confusion. Even as they danced and socialized in this ghostly recreation of the ship's final evening, their eyes remained wide with panic, their mouths open in silent screams that contradicted the elegant social gathering they were performing. I understood then that this wasn't a simple haunting or residual psychic energy from a maritime disaster. The Orion had become a supernatural prison, trapping the souls of everyone who had been aboard. When whatever catastrophe claimed the ship, they were doomed to repeat their final evening for eternity, conscious of their fate, but unable to escape the endless cycle. and they had recognized me as something different, something alive, something that could potentially share their imprisonment or, perhaps, offer the companionship they'd been denied. For however long they'd existed in this underwater purgatory. The dancing couples moved closer to where I hovered in the water, their choreographed movements subtly herding me toward the center of the ballroom. The passengers at the dining tables turned in their chairs to face me directly, their spectral attention focused on my presence with an intensity that made my regulator feel suddenly heavy in my mouth. More spirits materialized from alcoves and doorways I hadn't noticed before. Children in formal clothes appropriate to the early 20th century. Elderly passengers who clutched at walking sticks that existed only in their phantom realm. Crew members from every department of the ship's operation. The ballroom filled beyond its physical capacity as souls pressed closer, their desperate need for contact with the living world, radiating through the water like pressure waves. My comm system gave up entirely, producing only static, punctuated by whispers in languages I didn't recognize. But somehow, through the interference, I began to perceive meaning in the spectral voices. Not words exactly, but emotional content that bypassed language and spoke directly to my consciousness. Stay with us. Don't leave us alone. It's been so long since anyone could see us. You're real, you're alive. Please don't go back to the surface world. We remember what light looks like, what warmth feels like. Help us remember. The pleading quality in their phantom communication was overwhelming, pressing against my mind like physical weight. These weren't malevolent spirits seeking to drag me down out of hatred or revenge. They were terrified, lonely souls who had been trapped in isolation for so long that my presence represented their first hope of companionship in decades or centuries. I tried again to move toward the ballroom entrance, but the wall of spectral figures had become impenetrable. The captain with the torn uniform stood directly in my path, his hands raised not in threatening gestures but in supplication. Behind him, passengers linked arms to form a barrier that I somehow couldn't push through, despite their translucent nature. The dancing continued around me, couples spinning in perfect formation, while the phantom orchestra played their silent waltz. But now I could see that the dancers' movements were keeping me contained within an invisible circle at the center of the ballroom floor. Every time I tried to swim in any direction, a new couple would glide into my path, their ethereal forms, creating obstacles that defied physical laws. My depth gauge and dive computer continued showing normal readings for 450 feet of depth, but the water temperature had dropped to levels that made my thermal protection. Warnings flashed continuously. The cold seemed to emanate from the spirits themselves, as if their supernatural presence was draining heat from the surrounding environment. I scanned the ballroom walls desperately, looking for any exit route. The spectral passengers hadn't anticipated. The main entrance remained blocked by the ship's officers, but there had to be service corridors, staff entrances, or emergency exits that might not be as heavily guarded by the desperate souls. Near the back of the ballroom, partially hidden behind one of the ornate columns, I spotted what appeared to be a much smaller doorway. Unlike the grand entrances designed for passenger use, this looked like it might connect to the ship's service areas, corridors used by crew members to move through the vessel without disrupting the elegant spaces reserved for paying customers. The spectral passengers hadn't yet noticed my attention to the service entrance. They remained focused on their eternal waltz, their phantom social gathering, their desperate attempts to engage with the first living person they'd encountered in their underwater prison. But getting to that doorway would mean pushing through the crowd of ghostly figures, past dancing couples who had somehow learned to use their ethereal forms to create very real obstacles to my movement. And I had no idea what lay beyond that service corridor. More supernatural manifestations structural damage that could trap me, or passages that led deeper into the ship's interior rather than back to open water. The woman in the evening gown, who had first appeared to me, broke away from the dancing and approached directly. Her terrified expression, now mixed with something that looked almost like hope. She reached toward me with both hands, her phantom fingers stopping just short of my faceplate, as if some barrier prevented actual contact. Behind her, the entire gathering of spectral passengers and crew began moving closer, their individual circles of supernatural cold merging into a unified Arctic presence that made my equipment struggle against the temperature drop. They weren't trying to harm me, but their collective need for companionship was becoming a physical force that threatened to trap me as permanently as whatever disaster had originally claimed their ship. The service corridor beckoned from behind its column, offering my only possible escape route from the ballroom and the desperate souls who had made it their eternal dance floor. I pushed through the wall of spectral figures toward the service corridor, my fins cutting through ghostly forms that offered just enough resistance to slow my progress. The dancing couples parted reluctantly as I approached the narrow doorway, their phantom waltz dissolving into desperate reaching motions that followed me toward my escape route. The service corridor beyond proved to be a cramped maintenance passage designed for crew members rather than passengers. Unlike the elegant ballroom spaces, this area showed the utilitarian construction of the ship's working sections: bare metal walls, exposed piping, and narrow clearances that made maneuvering with my bulky rebreather system challenging. But the ghostly manifestations didn't diminish once I left the ballroom. Instead, they intensified dramatically. Spectral crew members rushed past me in both directions, their arms loaded with phantom luggage, life preservers, and emergency equipment that existed only in whatever dimensional space they occupied. Their faces bore expressions of absolute panic as they replayed what must have been their final moments aboard the Orion. A steward in a torn uniform clutched an armload of life jackets, his mouth moving in silent shouts as he hurried toward passenger areas that no longer contained anyone living to save. Behind him, a junior officer carried what appeared to be ship's papers and passenger manifests, his eyes wide with terror as he rushed toward duty stations that had failed him decades or centuries ago. Their movements created a supernatural traffic jam in the narrow corridor, forcing me to swim through their translucent forms, while they continued their eternal emergency protocols. That's when my equipment began failing in earnest. My primary dive lights flickered erratically, the powerful LED beams cutting in and out like electrical connections, shorting under water pressure. I tapped the housing, trying to restore steady illumination, but the lights died completely with a final, weak flash. The corridor plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the eerie phosphorescence of the spectral crew members themselves. The ghosts glowed with a cold blue-white radiance that provided just enough visibility to navigate, but created an otherworldly atmosphere that made the cramped passage feel like a supernatural highway. Their luminescent forms moved past me in endless procession, each one replaying their desperate final actions in loops that had continued. For however long the Orion had rested on the seafloor, my rebreather system's computer display began showing readings that defied every law of physics and diving medicine. I understood. The depth gauge fluctuated wildly between my actual position at 450 feet and impossible measurements, suggesting crushing abyssal pressures of thousands of feet. Phantom pressure changes registered on the system, as if the ship were actively sinking around me, the hull groaning under imaginary stress that my equipment somehow detected and measured. The CO2 scrubber warnings flashed continuously, while my oxygen partial pressure readings showed values that should have been impossible at my current depth. Either my life support system was malfunctioning, catastrophically, or the supernatural energy surrounding me was interfering with electronic components in ways that had never been documented in diving safety manuals. "Eleanor, my equipment is going crazy down here." I tried to report, but static filled my headset in response. Her voice had completely disappeared from my comm system, replaced by a crescendo of spectral whispers that seemed to emanate from the metal walls themselves. Fragments of panic-stricken conversations in multiple languages echoed through the water, overlaid with the phantom sounds of rushing water, screaming passengers, and groaning metal that replayed the Orion's final catastrophic moments. The supernatural audio grew louder as I progressed deeper into the ship's service areas. I could distinguish individual voices now. A woman crying for her children. A man shouting orders that no one could follow. Crew members calling out water levels and damage reports that described a disaster. I couldn't see but somehow felt happening around me, navigating by the ghostly phosphorescence of the spectral crew. I followed what appeared to be a maintenance stairwell, leading deeper into the ship's interior. The passage descended at a steep angle, requiring me to use handholds along the walls to control my movement through the confined space. Each surface I touched felt unnaturally cold, as if the metal itself had absorbed the supernatural energy that permeated the entire vessel. The ghostly procession continued around me, but now the spirits pressed closer with each foot of depth I gained. Their cold presence made my regulator feel sluggish and unresponsive, the breathing resistance increasing as phantom ice seemed to form in my air delivery system. I had to work harder to draw each breath, fighting against equipment that was struggling to function in an environment that challenged every assumption about underwater operations. A spectral engineer in coveralls pushed past me, carrying a phantom toolbox, his face streaked with what looked like oil and sweat that couldn't exist at this depth. Behind him, two more crew members wrestled with emergency equipment that I could see but not touch, their desperate teamwork replaying maintenance procedures that had failed to save anyone aboard the Orion. The stairwell continued its descent toward what had to be the engine room level, and with each step downward, the supernatural manifestations reached new levels of intensity. More spirits appeared from side passages and maintenance areas I hadn't noticed, creating a density of ghostly figures that made the narrow stairwell feel crowded beyond its physical capacity. The phantom sounds grew deafening, despite producing no actual noise my ears could register. Steam hissed from invisible boilers, while massive engines churned in whatever realm these spirits inhabited. Emergency bells clanged with urgent warnings about flooding, fire, or mechanical failure that had claimed the ship during its final moments. My regulator began freezing intermittently, the cold presence of so many concentrated spirits affecting my life support equipment in ways that shouldn't be possible. Each breath became a struggle as ice formed in the second stage mechanism, forcing me to manually clear the system every few minutes to maintain airflow. I reached what appeared to be the engine room level, and the corridor opened into a massive space that dwarfed even the grand ballroom above. The engine room stretched out before me, like a cathedral of industrial machinery, its soaring ceiling disappearing into supernatural darkness, while phantom boilers and steam engines filled the space with ghostly mechanical complexity. Here, the manifestations reached absolute fever pitch. Spectral engineers worked frantically at phantom controls, their hands moving over gauges and valves that existed only in their eternal replay of the ship's final crisis. Coal-black stokers shoveled invisible fuel into furnaces that glowed with supernatural fire, their faces streaked with sweat and soot that belonged to a different era entirely. The air, if it could be called that in this underwater environment, filled with the phantom heat and pressure of steam engines running at emergency power. The overwhelming psychic weight of hundreds of trapped souls pressed against my consciousness like physical force. Every spirit in the engine room turned their attention to my presence, their individual desperations combining into a collective need that threatened to crush my sanity along with my diving equipment. My depth gauge spun wildly between readings. My rebreather alarm screamed, warnings about systems that couldn't possibly malfunction in the ways they were reporting. And the spectral noise of the phantom disaster reached levels that made my skull feel like it was vibrating, despite the absence of actual sound. The ghostly engineers abandoned their phantom duties and began moving toward me with the same desperate pleading I'd encountered in the ballroom. But here, their numbers were overwhelming. Dozens of spectral figures pressed closer, their cold presence making my equipment struggle against temperature drops that registered on every sensor I carried. And somewhere in the supernatural chaos of the engine room, I realized I was no longer just documenting an impossible wreck. I was trapped in a supernatural prison, with souls who had been waiting decades or centuries for someone living to share their eternal torment. The psychic weight of hundreds of desperate souls crashed over me like a physical wave, pressing against my consciousness with force that made my skull feel like it was compressing under impossible pressure. Every gauge on my rebreather system spun wildly as phantom depths registered readings that belonged to abyssal trenches rather than the 450 feet where the Orion actually rested. The supernatural interference wasn't just affecting my electronics anymore. It was rewriting the basic physics of my environment. Around me, the engine room filled with spectral activity that defied every law of underwater dynamics I understood. Ghostly engineers rushed between phantom control panels, their translucent hands moving over gauges and valve wheels that existed only in whatever dimensional space they occupied. Steam hissed from invisible boilers, while massive engines churned with supernatural power, creating industrial noise that I felt rather than heard through the water. Coal-black stokers shoveled endless loads of phantom fuel into furnaces that glowed with cold fire, their faces streaked with sweat and soot that had no business existing at this depth. The entire engine room operated at fever pitch, replaying whatever emergency had consumed the ship during its final moments with mechanical precision that never varied, never resolved, never ended. But now they were all turning their attention away from their eternal duties to focus on me. One by one, the spectral workers abandoned their phantom stations and began moving in my direction. A chief engineer in oil-stained coveralls stepped away from a massive gauge cluster, his mouth moving in silent commands while he gestured toward my position with desperate urgency. Behind him, junior mechanics dropped their ghostly tools and followed, their faces bearing the same expression of pleading terror I'd encountered throughout the ship. My emergency backup lights began failing under the supernatural load, their LED beams flickering erratically before dimming to barely functional levels. The engine room plunged into spectral twilight, broken only by the cold phosphorescence of the ghostly workers themselves and the eerie glow of phantom machinery that operated without fuel, without heat, without any connection to the physical world I understood. Through the supernatural darkness, I spotted something that made my chest tighten with desperate hope. High above the engine room floor, near what had to be the ship's central superstructure, a large circular opening pierced the overhead bulkhead. The shaft beyond disappeared into darkness, but its size and position suggested a major ventilation duct or smokestack access route that would lead directly toward the surface. Unlike the cramped maintenance passages I'd been navigating, this opening looked wide enough to accommodate my bulky rebreather system, assuming I could reach it. The shaft beckoned like a lifeline to the surface world, but getting there would require swimming vertically through 20 feet of open engine room space, while surrounded by increasingly desperate spirits. who somehow sensed my intention to abandon them. The ghostly engineers pressed closer, their individual cold presences merging into Arctic conditions that made my regulator struggle against ice formation. In the second stage mechanism, each breath became a fight. As phantom frost affected my life support systems in ways that had never been documented in any diving safety manual I'd studied, then the spectral hands began reaching for me in earnest. Unlike the tentative grasping I'd experienced in the ballroom, these phantom touches carried real resistance. Ghostly fingers passed through my dive suit and equipment without making physical contact, but somehow created drag that slowed my movement through the water. Spectral arms wrapped around my legs and fins, their ethereal substance, offering no tactile sensation, yet generating very real impedance to my swimming motion. A spectral chief petty officer with torn uniform stripes reached toward my faceplate, his mouth moving in silent pleas, while his eyes fixed on mine with devastating need. Behind him, a young engineer clutched at my tank assembly, his ghostly hands creating no pressure I could feel, but somehow affecting my buoyancy control in subtle ways that made maintaining position increasingly difficult. My rebreather's computer display flashed a cascade of critical warnings that painted my situation in stark mathematical terms. The CO2 scrubber showed saturation levels that should have been impossible after only a few hours of diving, while my oxygen partial pressure readings fluctuated wildly between safe parameters and readings that suggested hypoxic conditions. Either my life support system was failing catastrophically, or the supernatural energy surrounding me was interfering with chemical processes that kept me alive at depth. Most alarming, my remaining air supply showed reserves that barely registered on the gauge. The supernatural interference wasn't just corrupting electronic displays. It was somehow affecting the actual gas mixture in my rebreather's circulation loop. Consuming oxygen faster than the system could replace it through normal chemical reaction cycles. Time was running out in ways that transcended normal diving emergencies. The spectral workers sensed my growing desperation and responded with increased urgency of their own. More spirits materialized from alcoves and machinery spaces. I hadn't noticed swelling their numbers until the engine room felt crowded beyond its physical capacity. Each new manifestation added to the psychic pressure that pressed against my consciousness like mental weight, threatening to crush my sanity along with whatever remained of my diving equipment's functionality. Phantom debris began swirling around me in supernatural currents that had nothing to do with water movement. Ghostly coal dust, spectral steam, and ethereal mechanical components created a whirlwind of activity that existed only in the spirit's dimensional space, but somehow affected my ability to navigate through the static water environment. The phantom storm made visual navigation increasingly difficult, while my backup lights continued their gradual failure under supernatural load. Above me, the ventilation shaft opening remained tantalizingly visible through the spectral chaos, promising escape from the engine room's overwhelming supernatural activity. But reaching it would require abandoning much of my safety equipment to achieve the buoyancy needed for vertical ascent through 20 feet of ghost-infested space. My dive computer's decompression warnings began flashing with increasing urgency, calculating bottom time that exceeded safe parameters for ascent to surface pressure. Whatever time distortion I'd experienced while trapped in the ship's supernatural influence had stretched my depth exposure far beyond normal diving protocols. Even if I reached the ventilation shaft immediately, I would need careful decompression management to avoid potentially fatal nitrogen bubble formation in my bloodstream. The ghostly engineers reached their crescendo of desperation as they recognized the mathematical reality of my situation. Their phantom voices somehow penetrated my damaged comm system, bypassing normal radio frequency to speak directly to my consciousness with emotional content that transcended language barriers. Don't leave us alone. We've been waiting so long for someone who could see us. The surface world forgot we existed. You're the first person to know we're here. Stay with us. Share our eternity. It's not so terrible once you accept it. Their collective pleading pressed against my mind like psychological weight, offering the companionship of hundreds of souls who had been trapped in isolation for decades or centuries. Part of me understood their desperation, the absolute loneliness of existing in a supernatural prison, with no hope of rescue, no possibility of escape, no connection to the living world they had lost. But survival instinct overrode empathy as my remaining air reserves dropped toward levels that would make ascent impossible, regardless of decompression requirements. The ventilation shaft waited above me like a portal to salvation, but getting there would mean swimming through the densest concentration of spectral activity I'd encountered anywhere in the ship. The ghostly engineers formed an increasingly solid wall between me and my escape route, their ethereal forms somehow creating obstacles that defied every law of physics, while their desperate need for living companionship threatened to trap me as permanently as whatever disaster had originally claimed their vessel. My emergency backup lights flickered one final time before dying completely, plunging the engine room into absolute darkness, broken only by the cold phosphorescence of hundreds of supernatural manifestations and the eerie glow of phantom machinery that would continue its eternal operation long after I had either escaped or joined the Orion's crew of trapped souls. The ventilation shaft beckoned from above, promising freedom. If I could abandon enough equipment to achieve the buoyancy needed for escape, while somehow fighting through spectral resistance that grew stronger with each desperate spirit who sensed my intention to return to the surface world, they could never reach again. The ventilation shaft opening loomed above me like a portal to salvation, but reaching it meant swimming vertically through 20 feet of space, packed with hundreds of desperate spirits who sensed my intention to escape their eternal prison. My emergency backup light cast a weak beam through the supernatural darkness as I kicked upward, fighting against spectral resistance that grew stronger with each foot of ascent. The ghostly engineers and crew members surged upward behind me like a supernatural tide, their phosphorescent forms creating a column of cold light that followed my movement toward the overhead opening. Phantom hands clutched at my fins and tank assembly, their ethereal touch creating drag that made every kick feel like swimming through molasses. Despite the absence of any physical contact I could actually feel, I reached the ventilation shaft entrance and immediately understood the full scope of my predicament. The circular opening measured barely 18 in across, wide enough for a person without dive gear, but impossibly narrow for someone wearing a full rebreather system with its bulky backpack configuration and extended hoses. The metal ductwork disappeared into darkness above me, twisting through the ship's superstructure toward what I hoped was the main smokestack opening. I positioned myself at the entrance and tried to push my rebreather pack through first, but the metal framework caught against the ductwork edges with mechanical precision. The opening was simply too small for my primary life support system. Behind me, the ghostly crew pressed closer, their individual cold presences merging into Arctic conditions that made my regulator freeze intermittently. Each breath became a struggle as phantom ice formed in my second stage mechanism, forcing me to manually clear the system every few seconds to maintain airflow. The ship itself began fighting against my escape attempt with supernatural force that defied every law of physics. Metal groaned around me with phantom stress, the ductwork walls shifting and contracting as if the Orion's superstructure was trying to collapse the ventilation system around me. Impossible mechanical sounds echoed through the water, steam hissing from non-existent boilers, emergency bells clanging warnings about flooding that had occurred decades or centuries ago, massive engines churning with supernatural power that belonged to a different era entirely. My backup light flickered weakly as the spectral energy reached new levels of intensity. The beam dimmed to barely functional levels, casting just enough illumination to reveal the continuing ascent path, but leaving everything beyond a few feet in absolute darkness. The ghostly phosphorescence of the pursuing spirits provided additional visibility, but their cold light created an otherworldly atmosphere that made the narrow shaft feel like a supernatural tunnel between dimensions. I made the decision that would either save my life or kill me within the next 10 minutes. Working quickly with numbing fingers, I disconnected my primary rebreather system and let the bulky pack drift downward toward the waiting spirits. The ghostly hands reached for the abandoned equipment eagerly, as if claiming some part of me might compensate for losing my living presence entirely. My emergency air bottle contained perhaps 10 minutes of breathing gas under ideal conditions, less if the supernatural interference continued affecting my respiratory metabolism the way it had been corrupting every other biological process. Without the bulky rebreather pack, I squeezed through the ventilation opening, like threading a needle with my life hanging in the balance. The shaft walls pressed against my wetsuit from all sides, creating claustrophobic conditions that made every movement a calculated risk. Too much force would wedge me permanently in place, while too little progress would cost precious seconds. I couldn't afford to lose. The ductwork angled sharply upward through the ship's superstructure, following a path that twisted through multiple deck levels toward what had to be the main smokestack. Each turn required careful maneuvering to avoid getting stuck, while my emergency air supply hissed steadily toward empty with mechanical precision that measured my remaining life in cubic feet of compressed gas. Behind me, the spectral voices continued their direct assault on my consciousness, but their psychological weight began diminishing as I climbed higher through the ship structure. The supernatural energy that had overwhelmed me in the engine room seemed concentrated in the vessel's lower levels, weakening with each foot of vertical distance I gained from the main manifestation areas. The shaft narrowed again at what appeared to be a major structural junction, forcing me to remove my emergency light pack and navigation equipment to continue the ascent. Each piece of abandoned gear represented another safety margin, sacrificed for the possibility of reaching the surface alive. But staying put meant certain death as my air supply approached critical depletion levels. The ductwork opened into a larger chamber that had to be part of the smokestack's main structure. Fresh water movement suggested proximity to open ocean, and far above me, a faint suggestion of light beckoned like hope, made visible through supernatural darkness. The shaft continued upward through the remaining superstructure, but each section required abandoning more equipment to maintain progress through increasingly narrow passages. Below me, the Orion's ghostly lights began fading as the trapped spirits settled back into their eternal patterns, their supernatural energy receding like a tide that had failed to claim another soul for their perpetual imprisonment. But I could still feel their cold touch on my consciousness, a connection that would never fully disappear, no matter how far I traveled from their underwater prison. My emergency air supply gauge showed reserves that might sustain life for another 5 minutes. If I managed my breathing perfectly and avoided any physical exertion beyond minimal swimming movements. The surface waited somewhere above me in the darkness, promising salvation if I could maintain consciousness and proper ascent discipline through the remaining vertical distance. I kicked upward through the final section of ductwork, my vision beginning to blur from oxygen deprivation and the early symptoms of decompression sickness that would plague me for days if I survived the next few minutes. The narrow shaft squeezed around me like a metallic throat, demanding the sacrifice of every remaining piece of equipment except the regulator that delivered my final breaths of compressed air. Above me, the faint light grew stronger with each desperate kick, promising freedom from the supernatural prison that had nearly claimed my life, along with the hundreds of souls who would remain trapped in their underwater purgatory. For however long the Orion continued its impossible existence on the Caribbean seafloor, I kicked through the final section of ductwork, with my lungs burning and consciousness slipping away in fragments. Each movement, a calculated gamble against the emergency air supply that hissed toward empty with mechanical precision. The narrow shaft pressed against me from all sides, demanding the sacrifice of my emergency light pack and navigation computer to continue the ascent. But above me, the water grew brighter with each desperate stroke. The smokestack opening appeared like a portal between dimensions, a circular frame of metal that separated the supernatural prison below from the normal ocean above. I squeezed through the final restriction and burst into open water, my body exploding upward with the last thrust of my fins as the ghostly grip finally released me from the ship's influence. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Clean Caribbean water surrounded me, instead of the supernatural atmosphere that had corrupted every breath and thought for what felt like hours. My emergency air supply gauge fluttered near empty, the needle touching red zones that meant death within minutes. But the water itself felt normal again. No phantom ice formation in my regulator, no spectral voices pressing against my consciousness, no equipment readings that defied basic physics. The surface appeared impossibly distant above me, a faint shimmer of light that seemed to mock my desperate situation. My dive computer had gone completely dark, its screen blank and unresponsive after the supernatural interference, had fried every electronic component I carried. Without reliable depth readings or ascent rate information, I could only estimate my position by the intensity of sunlight filtering down through the water column. The early symptoms of decompression sickness hit me like physical blows as my body processed the mathematical reality of my situation. Sharp pains lanced through my joints. My left shoulder felt like someone was driving spikes through the bone, while my knees throbbed with each heartbeat. Dizziness made it difficult to maintain proper orientation, and my vision kept blurring around the edges as nitrogen bubbles formed in my bloodstream. I had been trapped inside the wreck for over 3 hours. The realization made my emergency air supply feel even more precious as it hissed toward complete depletion. 3 hours at 450 feet exceeded every safety protocol I had ever learned, pushing my nitrogen absorption far beyond levels that normal decompression procedures could handle safely. Even with immediate medical treatment, I faced serious risk of permanent neurological damage from bubble formation in my spinal cord and brain tissue. My emergency beacon flickered weakly on my remaining equipment, its LED indicator flashing erratically instead of maintaining the steady pulse that would guide rescue vessels to my position. The supernatural interference had corrupted its signal processor, making coordination with Eleanor or any surface vessels highly uncertain. She might not even know where to look for me, assuming my position transmissions had been as garbled as every other electronic system the spirits had touched. The urge to rocket toward the surface overwhelmed every rational thought as my air supply approached total exhaustion. My body screamed for immediate access to surface air, demanding that I abandon careful ascent protocols in favor of desperate survival instinct. But rapid decompression would kill me more efficiently than drowning. Nitrogen bubbles forming in my circulatory system would stop my heart or cause massive strokes long before I could reach medical treatment. I forced myself to ascend slowly, fighting against panic, that threatened to override 20 years of diving training. Each breath from my nearly empty emergency bottle had to last as long as possible, while I maintained ascent rates that wouldn't trigger catastrophic bubble formation. The balance was impossible, climbing fast enough to reach air before suffocation, while ascending slowly enough to avoid death from decompression trauma. At 300 feet, my emergency air supply finally gave its last hiss and went silent. My lungs held maybe 40 seconds of usable air at that pressure, less if panic increased my metabolic rate. The surface waited another 300 feet above me, requiring at least 5 minutes of controlled ascent to reach safely. The mathematics were simple and brutal. I would lose consciousness from hypoxia long before reaching breathable atmosphere, and unconscious divers don't maintain proper ascent discipline. But somehow I kept climbing, my body running on reserves I didn't know existed, while my vision tunneled toward unconsciousness. The water around me brightened gradually as I approached shallower depths, the deep indigo giving way to lighter blue that promised salvation if I could maintain awareness for just a few more minutes. My joints screamed with decompression pain that felt like my bones were being twisted apart from the inside. The nitrogen bubbles forming in my tissue created pressure that no amount of diving experience had prepared me to handle. But I continued the slow ascent because stopping meant certain death and rushing meant equally certain death through different biological processes. At 200 feet, I should have begun formal decompression stops to allow my body time to eliminate excess nitrogen safely. The protocols called for multiple staged stops at decreasing depths, spending precious minutes at each level, while bubbles dissolved back into my bloodstream through normal respiratory processes. But without air to breathe during those stops, decompression discipline became academic theory rather than practical survival strategy. My emergency beacon continued, its erratic flashing, the corrupted signal probably appearing as equipment malfunction. To any rescue coordination, monitoring communication frequencies. Eleanor would be trying to reach me through normal radio channels, receiving only static and interference that had no explanation in conventional diving emergencies. The supernatural connection to the Orion faded gradually as I climbed away from the wreck, but it never disappeared entirely. I could still sense the trapped spirits far below me, their cold presence lingering in my consciousness like phantom pain from an amputated limb. Part of me would always remain connected to their underwater prison, carrying knowledge of their existence that no one else would ever believe or understand. At 100 feet, my vision began to blur seriously from nitrogen narcosis and oxygen deprivation working together to shut down my cognitive functions. The Caribbean sun blazed overhead like a distant star, its light growing stronger with each kick upward, but still impossibly far away. My body felt like it was moving through liquid concrete, each swimming motion requiring enormous effort, while my muscles ran on fumes from oxygen debt. The decompression pain reached levels that made coherent thought almost impossible. My left arm felt like the bones were shattering inside my wetsuit, while electric shocks ran through my spine with each movement. These were the warning signs of serious neurological involvement. Nitrogen bubbles forming in my central nervous system, where they could cause permanent paralysis or death. But I kept climbing because stopping was not an option, and rushing would kill me just as efficiently as suffocation. Somewhere above me waited rescue and medical treatment. Assuming my corrupted beacon managed to transmit enough signal for Eleanor to coordinate search efforts. The world above had no idea what I had experienced in the depths, no framework for understanding the supernatural prison that held hundreds of souls in eternal torment. At 50 feet, the water turned crystal clear and brilliant blue, showing me just how close salvation appeared while remaining desperately out of reach. My consciousness flickered like a dying light bulb, fading in and out as my oxygen-starved brain struggled to maintain basic life functions. Each upward kick became a monumental effort that exhausted reserves I didn't possess. But somehow my body continued climbing toward the surface that promised air and life, an escape from the supernatural nightmare below. The trapped spirits of the Orions settled back into their eternal imprisonment far beneath me, their ghostly lights dimming until the wreck appeared, as nothing more than a dark shape against the seafloor. But their whispered pleas still echoed in my thoughts, promising that I would carry their memory and their desperate need for acknowledgement. Long after I returned to the surface world that had forgotten they ever existed. 20 feet from salvation, my vision finally gave up the fight and began going black around the edges, while the Caribbean sun blazed overhead, like hope made visible through supernatural darkness. The first sensation that pulled me back toward consciousness was the rough texture of weathered wood against my face, followed by voices, speaking rapid Spanish somewhere above me. My wetsuit clung to my body like a second skin, but the familiar pressure of water was gone, replaced by the solid deck of what felt like a fishing boat, rocking gently beneath me. Pain hit me in waves as awareness returned. My left shoulder felt like someone had driven railroad spikes through the joint, while my knees throbbed with each heartbeat in a rhythm that made coherent thought almost impossible. The decompression sickness had taken hold with a vengeance. Nitrogen bubbles forming in my tissues and creating pressure that no amount of diving experience had prepared me to handle. I tried to speak, but my throat felt raw, and my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The Spanish voices grew more animated, and I caught fragments that my oxygen-starved brain struggled to translate. Something about buzo and enfermo and urgent radio communications to shore-based authorities. A weathered face appeared in my limited field of vision, an older fisherman with deep-set eyes that held the kind of concern reserved for people pulled from the edge of death. He spoke gently in accented English, asking if I could understand him, while his hands checked my pulse and breathing with surprising medical knowledge. "You were floating face down 3 miles from where your friend said you should be," he told me, his voice steady despite the obvious severity of my condition. "We almost missed you, but the sun caught your tank and made it flash like a signal." 3 miles. The realization made my head spin even worse than the decompression symptoms, already plaguing my cognitive functions. I had no memory of traveling that distance from the Orion's position, no recollection of ascending through the final 20 feet of water that separated me from salvation. The last clear image in my mind was the ghostly woman in the evening gown, her terrified face looking up at me from the depths. As consciousness faded, the fisherman continued his examination, noting the damage to my remaining equipment with professional efficiency. My emergency beacon hung by a single clip, its housing cracked and LED display flickering erratically. The regulator I had somehow kept in my mouth during the ascent showed stress fractures along the second stage housing, while my wetsuit bore tears and abrasions that looked like something had tried to claw me back into the depths. Radio static filled the air as the fishing vessel's captain coordinated with rescue authorities. Through the garbled transmissions, I heard Eleanor's voice, cutting through the interference with desperate clarity, providing emergency diving medicine protocols to people who had never dealt with decompression emergencies. Her instructions were precise and professional, but I could hear the fear underneath her technical expertise. "Keep him flat and still," she was saying over the radio waves. "Monitor his breathing and consciousness levels. We need immediate helicopter evacuation to the nearest recompression facility. This is critical. He's been down too long and too deep." The captain relayed my vital signs while his crew secured me for transport, their movements efficient despite the obvious unfamiliarity with diving emergencies. They had pulled enough drowning victims from these waters to recognize serious medical trauma when they saw it, and my condition clearly fell into categories that demanded immediate professional intervention. As they prepared the helicopter landing area on their deck, I found myself slipping back toward unconsciousness, but not the peaceful darkness of normal sleep. Instead, I drifted into a twilight state where the boundary between reality and the supernatural experiences I had endured aboard the Orion began to blur in ways that would haunt me for weeks to come. The woman in the evening gown appeared in the water reflections, created by spray across the fishing boat's deck. Her translucent form flickered between visible and invisible states, just as it had in the ballroom far below the surface. She reached toward me with phantom hands that couldn't make contact, but somehow created the same cold pressure I had felt during my escape from the ship. "You promised to remember us," her voice whispered directly into my consciousness, bypassing my damaged hearing entirely. "Don't let them convince you we don't exist." I tried to respond, to acknowledge the connection that bound me to the hundreds of trapped souls, still imprisoned in their underwater purgatory. But my voice failed completely. The fishermen mistook my attempts at communication for delirium, noting my condition on their radio reports to the approaching helicopter crew. The helicopter's rotors grew louder overhead, their mechanical rhythm drowning out the spectral whispers that continued to echo in my thoughts. The medical evacuation team descended to the fishing vessel with professional precision, their equipment and training focused on the immediate crisis of keeping me alive through emergency transport to the recompression facility. Eleanor's voice guided them through the transfer procedures via radio, her instructions covering every detail from securing my airway to monitoring for additional symptoms of neurological involvement. I could hear her fighting to maintain clinical objectivity, while her personal fear for my condition bled through every technical directive she provided. The helicopter ride passed in fragments of awareness, punctuated by periods of complete unconsciousness. Between the mechanical vibrations and my body's struggle against nitrogen bubble formation, I found myself drifting between the medical emergency happening around me and supernatural echoes from the depths that refused to fade. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize my condition during the flight. Their conversations, a mix of technical terminology and urgent concern about the severity of my decompression symptoms. They had seen diving accidents before, but my case presented complications that exceeded their normal emergency protocols. "His depth exposure calculations don't make sense," one medic reported over the helicopter's communication system. "The computer readings show impossible combinations of time and pressure that would have killed him hours ago." They attributed the corrupted data to equipment failure, the same explanation that would eventually account for every piece of evidence supporting my experiences aboard the Orion. But I knew the supernatural interference had rewritten the basic physics of my diving equipment, creating readings that defied conventional understanding of underwater medicine. The recompression facility in Belize City appeared below us like a beacon of hope, its medical staff already prepared for the emergency evacuation. Eleanor had coordinated through multiple radio networks. The hyperbaric chamber waited like a technological lifeline, promising to reverse the nitrogen bubble formation that threatened permanent neurological damage. As they wheeled me toward the treatment facility, I caught sight of Eleanor running across the landing pad, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry that went far beyond professional concern. She had spent 4 hours coordinating search efforts while imagining the worst possible outcomes, and my condition clearly confirmed her fears about the severity of whatever had happened during my dive. The medical team began immediate assessment procedures, while Eleanor provided my diving history and emergency medical information to the attending physician. Dr. Ramirez, the facility's decompression specialist, reviewed my symptoms with the methodical approach of someone who had treated hundreds of diving accidents over his career. Severe type 2 decompression sickness with probable neurological involvement. He diagnosed after examining my joint pain and cognitive symptoms. We need immediate hyperbaric treatment and continuous monitoring for the next 18 hours minimum.